Muhammad Ali threw everything he had. Jabs that would crumple most men, combinations that had ended careers, shots that made the crowd gasp, and still, George Tuvalu stood there, not retreating, not wobbling, just standing. Most fighters facing that kind of toughness would panic. They'd swing wild. They'd gas out trying to find that one perfect punch. But Ali was different. Ali was smarter. Somewhere in the middle of that fight, while his corner screamed for the knockout, Ali went quiet inside his own mind. He read the situation. He adapted. And then he did something no one expected. He stopped trying to knock George Tuvalu down. Instead, he turned Tuvalu's greatest strength into his greatest weakness. And what happened after that fight, in the years that followed, would reveal a truth about toughness that no boxing ring could ever teach. To understand what made George Tuvalu so unbreakable, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand where he came from. Because George Tuvalu wasn't built in a gym. He was forged in the hard, unforgiving streets of Toronto's West End, in a time when being the son of Croatian immigrants meant you had to prove yourself every single day. George was born in 1937. His father worked in a slaughterhouse. His mother cleaned houses for wealthy families across the city. There was no extra money. There was no safety net. There was only survival. And in the neighborhood where George grew up, survival meant learning how to fight before you learned how to read. The kids on those streets didn't care about your dreams. They didn't care about your feelings. They cared about one thing. Could you take a punch? Could you stay standing when someone wanted to put you down? George learned young. He was thick, powerful, built low to the ground, like a fire hydrant. Other kids would swing at him. He wouldn't move. He'd take the shot, and then he'd keep coming. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't technique. It was something deeper, something that lived in his bones. He simply refused to fall. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was something that happened to him so early in life that he couldn't even remember it. But whatever it was, it became his identity. George Tuvalu was the kid who wouldn't go down. By the time he was a teenager, George had discovered boxing. Not the sweet science version of boxing. Not the dancing, jabbing, artistic version. He discovered the brutal, working-class version. The version where you walked forward no matter what. The version where you absorbed punishment and kept throwing until the other guy couldn't take it anymore. He wasn't fast, he wasn't flashy, but he was relentless. And in those early amateur fights, something became clear to everyone who watched him. You could hit George Tuvalu as hard as you wanted. He wouldn't go down. He turned professional in 1956 at just 18 years old. His first fight was in a small club in Toronto. The crowd was maybe 100 people. Cigarette smoke hung in the air. The ring was worn and stained, and George Tuvalu stepped through the ropes like he belonged there. He won that fight by knockout, and then he won the next one, and the next one. Word started spreading through the Canadian boxing scene. There's this kid from the West End, Croatian, built like a truck. You can't hurt him. You can hit him with everything you've got, and he just keeps coming. By the early 1960s, George Tuvalu was the Canadian heavyweight champion. But being the best in Canada wasn't enough. Not for George. He wanted the world. He wanted the title. He wanted to prove that a kid from the slaughterhouse could stand with anyone on the planet. And that hunger led him to one of the most controversial periods in American sports history. Because in 1966, Muhammad Ali was the heavyweight champion of the world. And Muhammad Ali needed an opponent. You have to understand the context. In 1966, Ali was supposed to fight Ernie Terrell for the title. But the fight fell apart. The Illinois Athletic Commission refused to sanction it because of Ali's controversial statements about the Vietnam War and his refusal to serve. Boxing venues across America shut their doors to him. He was toxic. He was unpatriotic, they said. He was trouble. And so, with nowhere else to turn, the fight got moved to Toronto. Maple Leaf Gardens, March 29, 1966. And just like that, George Tuvalu got the call he had been waiting for his entire life. The phone rang in George's small apartment. His wife, Lynn, was in the kitchen. Their sons were playing in the other room. George picked up the receiver, listened for a moment, and then his face changed. He hung up the phone and stood there, silent. Lynn asked him what was wrong. George shook his head. "Nothing's wrong," he said. "I just got a fight with Ali." Lynn stared at him. Muhammad Ali was the most famous athlete on the planet. He was fast, beautiful, poetic, devastating. He had destroyed Sonny Liston. He had beaten everyone they put in front of him. And now her husband, the kid from the West End, was going to step into the ring with him. "Can you beat him?" she asked. George looked at her with those heavy-lidded eyes. "I don't know," he said, "but I know one thing. He ain't gonna knock me out." The fight was only 3 weeks away. George trained like a man possessed. He knew he wasn't faster than Ali. Nobody was faster than Ali. He knew he couldn't outbox him. Ali was a genius in the ring, a chess master who saw combinations 3 moves ahead. But George had something Ali had never faced before. George had a chin made of concrete and a body that simply refused to quit. His strategy was simple. Walk forward. Take everything Ali could throw. Wait for him to get tired, and then hurt him. The night of the fight, Maple Leaf Gardens was electric. 15,000 people packed into the arena. The air was thick with anticipation. Ali danced into the ring first, bouncing on his toes, throwing shadow punches, talking to the crowd. He was magnificent. He was everything boxing had never seen before. And then George Chuvalo climbed through the ropes. Slow, deliberate. His face showed nothing. No fear, no excitement. Just purpose. The crowd roared for their hometown hero, but George barely seemed to notice. He was already somewhere else, somewhere inside himself, where nothing could reach him. The opening bell rang and Ali immediately went to work. That left jab, the fastest in boxing history, snapped out again and again. George walked forward. The jab hit him. He kept walking. Ali danced to the side, threw a combination, moved again. George kept walking. The first round was all Ali. The second round was all Ali. But something strange was happening. Ali was landing clean shots, beautiful shots, shots that would have dropped most heavyweights. And George Chuvalo was still there. Not hurt, not wobbling, just walking forward. By the 5th round, you could see the first flicker of confusion in Ali's eyes. He had hit this man with everything. The combinations were landing. The timing was perfect. But Chuvalo wouldn't go down. Between rounds, Ali's corner was screaming at him to stay patient. Keep boxing, don't get drawn into a war. But there was something primal awakening in Ali. He wanted the knockout. He needed it. He started loading up on his punches, trying to find that one shot that would end the night. And every single time, Chuvalo just ate it and kept coming. Round 7, round 8, round 9. Ali was still winning the fight, but something had shifted. His punches were losing their snap. His legs were getting heavy, and Chuvalo was still right there, walking through the fire, throwing bombs of his own. By the 11th round, Ali was in survival mode. He clinched whenever Chuvalo got close. He held on. He used every trick he knew to slow the pace down. And between rounds, as his corner worked on the swelling around his eyes, Ali had a realization that would change the rest of the fight. He couldn't knock George Chuvalo out. It wasn't going to happen. No matter how hard he hit him, no matter how clean the shot, Chuvalo was going to stay on his feet. And the more Ali tried to force the knockout, the more energy he wasted, the more he put himself at risk. So Ali did something that separated him from every other fighter in the world. He adapted. He stopped trying to hurt Chuvalo. He started trying to outsmart him. The last 4 rounds were a masterclass. Ali went back to basics. He jabbed. He moved. He scored points. He didn't chase the knockout anymore. He accepted what was in front of him and adjusted his strategy accordingly. And Chuvalo, for all his toughness, couldn't catch him. The fight went the full 15 rounds. Ali won by unanimous decision. But when the final bell rang, something remarkable happened. George Chuvalo was still standing. His face was battered. His body was bruised. But his legs were under him. He had taken over 200 punches from the greatest fighter of all time. And he had not gone down. Not once. Not even close. After the fight, Ali sat in his dressing room. Ice packs pressed against his swollen hands. A reporter asked him about Chuvalo. Ali was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that would echo through boxing history. "Chuvalo is the toughest guy I ever fought. He takes a punch better than anyone I've ever seen. Coming from Muhammad Ali, that was the highest compliment imaginable. But for George Chuvalo, it was bittersweet. He had proved he could survive anything. But surviving wasn't winning. And George Chuvalo wanted to win. The years that followed were difficult. George kept fighting because fighting was all he knew. He faced other champions. He faced other contenders. He lost some. He won some. But the big victory, the world title, always seemed just out of reach. And then, in 1972, he got another chance. Muhammad Ali was back, and he wanted a rematch. The fight was scheduled for May 1st, 1972, in Vancouver. 6 years had passed since their first encounter. Both men were older. Both men had changed. But one thing remained the same. George Chuvalo still refused to fall. The second fight was brutal in a different way. Ali was smarter now, more experienced, more patient. He knew exactly what he was dealing with. From the opening bell, he boxed beautifully, staying on the outside, picking Chuvalo apart with jabs and straight rights. George kept walking forward, just like before. But this time, Ali never panicked. He never tried to force the knockout. He just accumulated punishment round after round until Chuvalo's face was a mask of cuts and bruises. In the 12th round, the referee stopped the fight, not because Chuvalo was knocked down. He wasn't. He was still on his feet, still moving forward, still throwing punches. But he couldn't see any more. The cuts were too bad. The damage was too severe. And so, for the first time in his career, a fight was stopped while George Chuvalo was still standing. He walked back to his corner with his head high. He never complained about the stoppage. He knew the referee was right, but it hurt. It hurt more than any punch Ali had ever thrown, because George Chuvalo had built his entire identity around one simple truth. He wouldn't go down. And now, even though he was still standing, he had lost. The toughness that had defined his entire life, that had made him a legend in the ring, wasn't enough. Against the very best in the world, it wasn't enough. George retired from boxing in 1978 with a record of 73 wins, 18 losses, and 2 draws. In 93 professional fights, he was never knocked down. Not once. It's a record that still stands today. It's a record that may never be broken. But the real test of George Chuvalo's toughness was still coming. And this time, there would be no referee to stop the fight. This time, the punishment would just keep coming, and there would be no final bell. After boxing, George tried to build a normal life. He and Lynn had 5 children together, 3 sons and 2 daughters. George worked various jobs. He gave motivational speeches. He stayed connected to boxing as a trainer and commentator. But the transition was hard. Boxing had been his entire identity for over 20 years. Without it, he felt lost. And somewhere along the way, while George was trying to figure out who he was outside the ring, something dark crept into his family. It started with Jesse, his oldest son. Jesse was a beautiful kid, smart and talented, but troubled in ways George couldn't understand. He got involved with the wrong people. He started using drugs. George tried everything. He talked to Jesse. He screamed at Jesse. He threatened Jesse. He begged Jesse. Nothing worked. In 1985, Jesse died of a heroin overdose. He was 20 years old. George felt the blow land somewhere deep inside his chest. It was worse than any punch Ali had ever thrown. It was worse than anything he had ever experienced in the ring. Because in the ring, you could fight back. You could throw punches of your own. But this was an enemy he couldn't see. An enemy he couldn't hit. An enemy that had taken his son and left him standing there helpless with nothing but grief. But George Chuvalo was a fighter. That's all he knew how to be, so he did what he had always done. He absorbed the blow. He stayed on his feet. He kept moving forward. He threw himself into anti-drug activism, speaking at schools and community centers across Canada, telling kids about the dangers of addiction, using Jesse's story as a warning. It gave him purpose. It gave him a way to fight back. And then, 8 years later, the second blow landed. His son Stephen, who had struggled with depression and addiction his entire adult life, took his own life in 1993. George got the phone call in the middle of the night. He sat in the darkness of his living room, the phone still in his hand, and felt something crack inside him. 2 sons gone. The pain was unbearable. But George Chuvalo was still standing. That's what he did. He stood. Lynn was different. Lynn didn't have George's constitution. She didn't have that thing inside him that refused to break. Watching her sons die, one after another, destroyed her. She fell into a depression so deep that George couldn't reach her anymore. He tried. God knows he tried. He held her. He talked to her. He sat with her through the endless nights. But the light in her eyes had gone out. In 1996, Lynn Chuvalu ended her own life. She left a note saying she couldn't live with the pain anymore. George found her. How do you describe what that does to a person? How do you put into words the weight of burying your wife after burying two sons? Most people would have crumbled. Most people would have given up. But George Chuvalu was built differently. He had spent his entire life proving that he could take punishment and keep going. And so, even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, that's what he did. He kept going. But life wasn't done with him yet. 3 years after Lynn's death, his third son, George Lee, died of a drug overdose. 3 sons, his wife, all gone, all taken by demons he couldn't fight, enemies he couldn't see. George stood at his son's grave, 72 years old now, bent but not broken, and wondered what any of it had meant. The fights, the glory, the toughness. What did any of it mean when you couldn't protect the people you loved? But here's the thing about George Chuvalu. Here's the thing that makes his story more than just a tragedy. He didn't stop. He didn't give up. He didn't let the pain destroy him. Instead, he doubled down on his mission. He traveled across Canada, speaking to anyone who would listen about the dangers of drug addiction. He told his story, the whole story, with brutal honesty. He showed kids pictures of his sons. He told them about Lynn. He stood in front of auditoriums full of teenagers and let them see his pain, let them see what drugs could do to a family, hoping that maybe, just maybe, his suffering could save someone else. And people listened. They looked at this old man, this former boxer with the battered face and the heavy hands, and they saw something they recognized. They saw someone who had been knocked down by life in every way imaginable, and they saw that he was still standing, still fighting, still refusing to go down. In 2011, George Chuvalu was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame. He stood at the podium, 80 years old now, and looked out at the crowd. The room was full of boxing legends, champions, Hall of Famers, the greatest fighters in the history of the sport, and they were all applauding for him, for the kid from the West End who never won a world title but earned something more important, their respect. When he spoke, he didn't talk about his record. He didn't talk about the Ali fights. He talked about his family. He talked about the price of toughness. He talked about the fights you can't win, no matter how hard you try. And when he was done, the room was silent for a moment. Then, one by one, the legends rose to their feet. A standing ovation for a man who had never been knocked down in the ring. A standing ovation for a man who had lost everything outside of it and was still standing anyway. Muhammad Ali, who was in attendance that night despite his declining health, made his way slowly toward George. The two old warriors embraced. No words were necessary. They had spent 30 rounds of their lives trying to destroy each other, and now, at the end of the road, there was only respect, only love, only the understanding that passes between two men who have seen the absolute worst of each other and found something to admire anyway. George Chuvalu is still alive today, well into his 80s. His mind has been affected by the years of punishment in the ring, as so many boxers' minds are. But that core of steel is still there. That thing that refuses to fall is still there. He still does speaking engagements when his health allows. He still tells his story. He still stands up in front of young people and shows them the price of the choices we make. When people ask him how he survived it all, how he kept going after losing 3 sons, and his wife, George, always says the same thing. He says that quitting was never an option, that falling down meant staying down, that the only way forward was through. Some people call it stubbornness. Some people call it denial. But those who know George Chuvalu, those who have looked into his eyes and seen what lives there, they call it something else. They call it the human spirit in its purest form. The refusal to be destroyed, no matter what life throws at you. The story of George Chuvalu and Muhammad Ali is remembered as one of the great battles in boxing history. 2 fights, 30 rounds, hundreds of punches landed, and through it all, one man stayed on his feet no matter what. But that's not the real story. The real story is what happened after the lights went out and the crowds went home. The real story is a man who discovered that the toughest fights don't happen in the ring. They happen in the quiet moments when no one is watching. They happen in the grief that comes at 3 in the morning. They happen in the decision to get up and keep going when every part of you wants to lie down and give up. Ali was right that night in 1966. George Foreman was the toughest man he ever faced, but not because of his chin, not because of his ability to absorb punishment. Foreman was the toughest because he understood something that most people never learn. Being tough isn't about not feeling pain. It's about feeling all of it, every ounce of it, and choosing to keep standing anyway. It's about taking the worst that life can throw at you and refusing to let it define you. It's about getting up every single morning, no matter how much you've lost, no matter how heavy the weight, and putting one foot in front of the other. That's the legacy of George Foreman. Not the fights he won or lost, not the records he set, but the simple, profound truth that he demonstrated with his entire life. You can survive anything. You can lose everything and still find a reason to keep going. You can take punch after punch after punch and still be standing when the final bell rings. All you have to do is refuse to fall. The cameras are off now. The crowds are gone. The glory days are memories, faded like old photographs. But somewhere in Toronto, there's an old man with heavy hands and a battered face who still gets up every morning, who still puts one foot in front of the other, who still refuses to go down. And every time he does, every time he chooses to keep standing, he proves that Muhammad Ali was right all those years ago. George Foreman is the toughest man who ever lived, not because he couldn't be knocked down, but because he always got back up. Always. No matter what.